Hi boys and girls, it's Mrs. R. Ward. I'd like to share a story with you today, and the name of the story is Henry's Freedom Box. You'll notice this special medal at the top of the book, and that is called the Caldecott Honor Medal, and that means that this book is something very special. The year that the book was published, it was one of the very best books for its pictures. So this is a great honor for a book, and I think you'll see why when I read it to you. This book is a nonfiction book, although the pictures make it look like it might be fiction, but it is not. So as we're reading this book, I'd like you to think of many things about the time period and what is the theme of this book and what character traits did Henry exhibit, and also the people who helped him. So before we get started, I'd like to read to you the author's note. So the author has written something that helps us with the background of this book. Because you were not alive and I was not alive during slavery times, this will give us some great background knowledge. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. In the mid-1800s, there were about 4 million slaves living in the United States. Slaves were owned like tables or cows or wagons. Historians believe that between 60,000 and 100,000 slaves escaped for freedom, traveling on what was then called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't really a real railroad. It was a secret way that slaves made their way from the South to the North, because the South had slaves and the North did not. They hid in cars, rode on horseback, walked hundreds of miles through forests and swamps, and crossed flowing rivers in summer and icebound rivers in the winter. Conductors and station masters hid them and helped them through their journey. When Henry Brown climbed into his freedom box, he hoped that he would be carried to a safe world. He brought along a small tool to make air holes, a little water, and a few biscuits. Henry arrived in Philadelphia, having traveled 350 miles from Richmond, Virginia, in 27 hours. His story made the newspaper headlines in America and in Europe. Henry never found Nancy and his children. In 1850, he went to England, and there are some reports that he got remarried again. We don't know if this is absolutely true, but Henry Box Brown became one of the most famous runaway slaves in the Underground Railroad, the man who mailed himself to freedom. So now we're going to read the book, and I know you're going to love it. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Can you imagine not knowing your birthday? Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from trees like children are torn from their parents. One morning, the master called Henry and his mother to his bedside. They climbed the wide staircase, and the master was still in bed, and only his head was above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart was beating fast. Maybe the master would set us free. But the master said, "You are a good worker, Henry. I'm giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you. That would have been a lie. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. "Free bird, happy bird," Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves were swirling in the wind. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy. He poked the boy with a stick. If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you. Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both of their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon, there was a little baby, then another and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he will sell our children," she said. Henry sat very still. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No," cried Henry. Henry wouldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco," the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted tobacco leaves, but his heart was twisted in his chest. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves were tied together. The owner shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. "Father, Father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her that same moment that she saw him. When he wiped away his tears, Nancy too was gone. Just think if you were taken away from your parents and sold. That would be horrible. Henry no longer sang. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could think of were those carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree and into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. But how? As he lifted a crate, he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was very long. They met early the next day at the empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to the place where there are no slaves," he said. James stared at the box, then at Henry. "What if you cough? What if someone hears you?" "I will cover my mouth and hope," said Henry. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, "To William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Henry would be delivered to a friend in Philadelphia. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, "This side up, with care." Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or the work boss would think that he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew it wasn't bad enough, and he opened a bottle and put some oil on it. "No," cried James. Henry poured it on his hand. It burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand. They arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. You can tell how much he wanted his freedom when he's willing to hurt himself in order to get free. The sun was not up yet, and Henry climbed into the box. "Ready?" he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They knew the box. They didn't know what was in the box, and they just threw it in the baggage cart. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves splashing. This must be the steamboat headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst, but he was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. So just imagine being crunched in a little box and now being upside down where nobody paid attention to the handle with care and this side up. "I'm tired of standing," said someone. "Why don't we move that box and we can sit on it?" Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck. Now it was on the right side, now on the left, and suddenly it was right side up. I like how the illustrator took each one of those parts and illustrated it. It really gives you a great idea about what was happening to Henry. "What do you think's in here?" the first man said. "Mail, I guess," said the other. "I am mail," thought Henry, but not the kind that they imagine. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car, this time head up. He fell asleep to the rattling of the song of the train wheels. And those men are still sitting on top of Henry. He awoke with a loud knocking. "Henry, are you all right in there?" "All right," he answered. The cover was pried open and Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men smiled at him. "Welcome to Philadelphia." At last, Henry had a birthday, March 30th, 1949, the first day of freedom. And from that day on, he also had a middle name. Everyone called him Henry Box Brown. And that is the story of Henry's Freedom Box. The author is Ellen Levine, and the illustrator is Kadir Nelson. So think about it. Would you be brave like Henry? And I bet you know that Henry had courage. It's one of his character traits, and I would say that that is one of the themes of this book. So I hope you enjoyed that. I want you guys to know we miss you so much, and we really would love to see you in person, but it's the safest right now to stay at home. And thank you all for working on your schoolwork. And I just hope that you are able to go outside on the beautiful days and enjoy the sunshine. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a fantastic day.